At 7:55 a.m. on December 7, 1941, in the shallow, confined waters of Pearl Harbor, Japanese torpedoes struck the anchored battleships of the United States Pacific Fleet. The harbor was calm. The weather was clear. Most American aircraft sat parked wingtip to wingtip along the airfields of Oahu. From the perspective of the Imperial Japanese Navy, this was not an opening strike meant to win a war. It was an attempt to delay one. Japan entered the final months of 1941 already constrained by decisions made years earlier. The war in China, begun in 1937, had consumed manpower, shipping, and industrial output without delivering a decisive result. What had once been envisioned as a limited continental campaign had hardened into a permanent drain. By 1940, Japan imported over 80% of its oil. Most of it came from the United States. That dependency was not theoretical. It was mathematical. In July 1941, after Japanese forces occupied southern Indochina, the United States froze Japanese assets and imposed a full oil embargo. Japan's strategic reserves amounted to roughly 18 months of fuel under peacetime usage. Less under combat conditions. No new sources existed within Japan's territory. None could be developed in time. Every major institution in Tokyo understood what this meant. Without oil, the Navy would stop. The Air Force would stop. Industry would slow, then fail. Japan now faced a narrowing corridor of time in which action remained possible. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not argue that war with the United States was desirable. It argued that delay made defeat certain. The alternative, withdrawal from China, was politically impossible. By late 1941, the decision space had already collapsed. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, understood the imbalance clearly. He had studied in the United States. He knew American industrial capacity. He knew that Japan could not win a prolonged naval war. What he believed was narrower. If Japan struck first, seized the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, and built a fortified defensive perimeter across the Pacific, the cost of reversing those gains might exceed American political tolerance. This was not optimism. It was a calculation under constraint. Pearl Harbor was selected not because it guaranteed victory, but because it created time. The plan required precision. 6 fleet carriers, nearly the entire striking strength of Japanese naval aviation, would sail more than 3,000 miles without detection. The force would strike once. It would withdraw immediately. There would be no second chance. On the morning of December 7th, the attack achieved tactical surprise. Battleships were hit. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The Pacific Fleet was temporarily paralyzed. But the structure beneath the fleet remained. American aircraft carriers were not present. Fuel storage tanks were untouched. Repair facilities survived. Within hours, what had been sunk could be raised. What had been damaged could be repaired. Japan had delayed American response. It had not removed American capacity. That distinction would take months to surface. In the weeks that followed, Japanese forces moved rapidly. Hong Kong fell. Guam was taken. Wake Island resisted, then collapsed. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces were isolated and slowly driven back. British naval power in the region was shattered in days. For a brief period, the Japanese advance appeared unstoppable. Speed compensated for scarcity. Coordination compensated for scale. But beneath the expansion, limitations accumulated. Japan's shipbuilding capacity was finite. Its pilot training pipeline was narrow. Losses could not be replaced quickly. The United States, meanwhile, began mobilization on a scale that had no historical parallel. In 1942 alone, American shipyards would lay down more tonnage than Japan could build during the entire war. That imbalance was not immediately visible on the battlefield. In April 1942, American bombers launched from an aircraft carrier struck Tokyo. The physical damage was minimal. The psychological impact was not. The raid demonstrated that American carriers remained operational. It exposed gaps in Japan's defensive perimeter. More importantly, it triggered a response. Within the Naval General Staff, pressure grew to force a decisive carrier engagement. The objective was simple. Destroy the American carriers and the perimeter could be secured. The location chosen was Midway Atoll. Midway sat over 1,300 miles from the nearest Japanese base. It was isolated. It was vulnerable. The operation required extraordinary coordination, multiple task forces, a diversion toward the Aleutians, precise timing across vast distances. It assumed that American forces would react predictably and without prior knowledge. This assumption was incorrect. By mid-1942, American cryptanalysts had partially broken the Japanese naval code JN-25. They identified Midway as the target. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, concentrated his limited carrier strength north of the island. He did not have numerical superiority. He accepted risk. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese carrier aircraft struck Midway. The attack damaged installations but failed to neutralize the airfield. As Japanese aircraft returned low on fuel, hangar decks filled with armed planes being reconfigured for a second strike. At 10:20 a.m., American dive bombers arrived. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were fatally hit. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. A 4th, Hiryu, was destroyed later that day. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and a corps of veteran pilots trained over a decade. The defeat was operational. Its consequences were structural. Japan could replace ships. It could not replace experience. The war did not end at Midway. But options narrowed permanently. In August 1942, Japanese forces occupied Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The objective was to extend the perimeter and threaten Allied supply lines to Australia. Instead, the island became a contest of attrition. American forces landed and seized the unfinished airfield. What followed was 6 months of continuous combat. Night surface engagements favored Japan. Japanese cruisers and destroyers inflicted heavy losses. But logistics dictated outcomes. Japanese supply runs relied on destroyers operating at the edge of fuel capacity. They could deliver men. They could not deliver sufficient food, ammunition, or heavy equipment. American forces, though often tactically outmatched, were steadily reinforced. By February 1943, Japan evacuated Guadalcanal. The perimeter contracted. From this point forward, the Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer shaping the war. It was reacting to it. After Guadalcanal, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a choice it had long postponed. Whether to contest every American advance, or to conserve strength by trading space for time. Neither option restored initiative. Both accepted contraction. The decision that emerged was defensive in nature, but offensive in structure. Japan would allow the Americans to advance, then destroy them in a single decisive battle when the conditions were favorable. This concept was not new. It was deeply embedded in Japanese naval doctrine. What had changed was the material balance. By early 1943, Japanese fuel stocks were already strained. Losses in tankers, combined with restricted access to oil fields, meant that training hours were reduced. Pilots flew less. Carrier air groups practiced less. Coordination degraded quietly. At the same time, American carrier task forces grew in size and sophistication. New ships arrived continuously. Radar coverage improved. Pilot training expanded, not by shortening standards but by multiplying capacity. The asymmetry widened without announcing itself. In late 1943 and early 1944, American forces advanced through the Central Pacific. The Gilberts, the Marshalls. Each operation followed a pattern. Overwhelming carrier airstrikes. Amphibious landings. Rapid construction of airfields. Japanese garrisons fought to the end, but they were bypassed, isolated, and rendered irrelevant. The Imperial Japanese Navy waited. The next engagement, it believed, would decide the war at sea. That moment came in June 1944, as American forces moved against the Mariana Islands. Saipan, Tinian, Guam. Their capture would place American heavy bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. For Japan, this was a strategic red line. The combined fleet committed nearly all remaining carrier strength to intercept the invasion. On paper, the numbers appeared comparable. 9 Japanese carriers. Fewer American fleet carriers, though backed by light carriers and a growing reserve. What the numbers concealed was quality. Japanese pilot training programs had been shortened dramatically. Many aviators had fewer than 100 flight hours before combat. Fuel shortages limited practice. Night landings were rare. Complex maneuvers were avoided. American pilots, by contrast, arrived with extensive training and combat rotation experience. Radar-directed fighter control allowed American task forces to engage at range. On June 19, 1944, Japanese carrier aircraft launched from extreme distances. They encountered American fighters guided precisely to interception points. Wave after wave was destroyed before reaching target. The imbalance became unmistakable. By the end of the second day, Japan had lost over 400 aircraft. American losses were minimal. The Battle of the Philippine Sea did not simply defeat the Japanese carrier force. It removed it as a functioning instrument. Carriers remained afloat. Pilots did not. After the battle, Japan could no longer project air power at sea. What remained was surface strength and one final strategic hope. If American invasion forces could be struck directly, before establishing secure lodgements, losses might still alter political calculations. That opportunity appeared in October 1944. American forces landed on the island of Leyte in the Philippines. The operation threatened Japan's remaining sea lanes to Southeast Asia. Without those routes, fuel deliveries would collapse entirely. The Imperial Japanese Navy responded with its most complex plan since Midway. Multiple task forces would converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions. A carrier group, nearly devoid of aircraft, would act as decoy. Its purpose was explicit. Draw American carriers north, away from the landing beaches. Then surface forces, battleships and cruisers, would strike the invasion fleet. The plan acknowledged reality. Japanese carriers were no longer weapons. They were bait. The Battle of Leyte Gulf unfolded across several days and hundreds of miles. Japanese forces achieved moments of tactical surprise. In the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, American air power sank the battleship Musashi. In the battle off Samar, Japanese surface ships unexpectedly encountered lightly armed American escort carriers. For a brief interval, the outcome was uncertain. But coordination failed. Command decisions were delayed. Signals were misinterpreted. Fuel limitations restricted maneuver. American forces, though disorganized at moments, retained overwhelming depth. By the end of the battle, Japan had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers and numerous destroyers. The United States lost no capital ships. Leyte Gulf was not merely a defeat. It was the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as an operational force. After October 1944, remaining Japanese warships were immobilized by fuel shortages. Training programs collapsed. Shipyards were increasingly vulnerable to air attack. The strategic focus shifted from maneuver to delay. Submarines, once a potential instrument of attrition, had been misused earlier in the war. Japanese doctrine prioritized fleet engagement over commerce raiding. By the time emphasis shifted, American anti-submarine defenses were layered and mature. Shipping losses declined. In April 1945, the battleship Yamato sailed from Japan toward Okinawa. The mission was explicit. She carried fuel for a one-way voyage. There was no expectation of return. Before reaching the island, Yamato was intercepted and sunk by American carrier aircraft. The operation had no strategic value. It was a manifestation of exhaustion. By the summer of 1945, Japan no longer possessed the naval capacity to influence the course of the war. The outcome had been decided long before. The assumptions that shaped Japan's naval strategy were not irrational. Given limited oil, limited industry, and geopolitical isolation, rapid expansion and a decisive early blow appeared logical. What proved catastrophic was the belief that time gained could be converted into strategic permanence. Each decision narrowed future options. Pearl Harbor committed Japan to a war against an industrial power it could not match. Midway concentrated irreplaceable assets. Guadalcanal drained logistics. The Philippine Sea expended the last trained air crews. Leyte Gulf consumed the remaining fleet. None of these moments guaranteed defeat on their own. Together, they formed a sequence in which recovery became impossible before failure was fully visible. The war at sea ended not with a final battle, but with the disappearance of capability. In the aftermath, the Pacific balance of power shifted permanently. The United States emerged as the dominant naval force across the Pacific. Japan's post-war security would rest not on fleets but on alliances. The lesson left behind was not one of ambition or restraint. It was one of constraint. When time, resources, and industrial capacity are limited, every decision consumes the future. often long before the outcome is clear.